In this final video lesson, we will talk about government policies which are aimed to reduce unemployment. Strictly speaking, they are both demand-side and supply-side policies. And because there are different types of unemployment, because people become unemployed for various reasons, these different types of unemployment can also be tackled using different techniques, using different measures. For example, structural and seasonal unemployment, which are caused by the structural changes in the society, which are inevitable because of the changes in the seasons of the year, they, however, can be reduced by improving labor mobility. So if there is a lack of demand for particular skills in a specific geographic area, by improving labor mobility, by helping people to relocate, to find jobs in some other geographical areas, we will be able to reduce this unemployment in the society. Or we can also reduce this by providing retraining, by helping people to acquire skills which are in demand. And even if they live in this resort town with very high demand for workers in hospitality sector in summer and lack of demand in other areas, if a particular person has additional skills which allow them to earn a living during other periods of the year, in winter, in spring, and so on, when there are no tourists, there will be low unemployment because they will still be busy even if there are no tourists. For example, if you are able to work as a freelancer online, for example, if you can set up an online business which does not depend on your tourist flow, then you will be able to earn some money even when you don't have any income from your main job. So generally, structural and seasonal unemployment can be helped by improving labor mobility and by retraining programs, by developing human capital. Frictional unemployment, which is caused by information imperfections, can also be reduced by improving these information flows, by providing better information to both workers and employers. For example, this can be achieved by creating additional job centers, employment agencies, setting up online portals, providing better information about available vacancies. Interestingly, it can also be reduced by reducing unemployment-related benefits, because very frequently in a society with very generous unemployment benefits, people simply don't have an incentive to go and search for a job. Because if you are able to live normally, but simply on your benefits, if you are paid, let's say, £1,000 for a year just to remain unemployed and do nothing, and you are a low-skilled worker anyway, and you would not probably be paid much more than this in any case, would you have a high incentive to go and search for a job? Would it make any sense for you to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and spend some time in a packed train to get to your job and then work for 8 to 10 hours there just to bring home maybe £1,200 at the end of the month, while you can earn 1,000 sitting at home doing nothing? Would you have an incentive to go and search for a job? Probably not. But if unemployment benefits are very, very limited, if you are only paid, let's say, £200-300 per month only, and you are eligible for these benefits for maybe a couple of months, and that's it, and then they will stop, definitely this would force you to get out of your house and start properly searching for a job, because otherwise you can start starving if you don't find anything. And definitely people will require much less time to find a job if they are not supported. So generally, by becoming harsher with unemployment rate can actually be drastically reduced. I'm not advocating this technique, but nevertheless, it's one of the methods which the government can implement. Next, cyclical unemployment, which, as we know, depends on the stage of the business cycle, can obviously be controlled, be reduced by manipulating the business cycle itself, by reducing real wage rates during the periods of high unemployment, which will increase demand for labor, or by increasing jobs through increasing aggregate demand. So any measures which we've discussed previously, which would stimulate aggregate demand, which would support aggregate demand, for example, reduction in taxes, or increasing government expenditure, or reducing interest rates to reduce cost of borrowing and stimulate consumption and investment. All of these, any type of expansionary policy, would increase aggregate demand, which will lead to additional supply provided, additional output generated, produced by companies to satisfy this extra demand, which will lead to job creation. And by supporting aggregate demand, by supporting the economy out of recession, the government can reduce cyclical unemployment. So these are the main concepts which you need to cover for this topic. So the majority of the exam material will be based on these specific concepts which we've covered. That's it for this particular week. I hope to see you next week in seminars. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye-bye.